All right. So again, I'm Sarah Lynch Thomason. I'm the events coordinator of the Swannanoa Valley Museum. We're glad you can join us this evening for our Western North Carolina History Cafe lecture on the Negro Motorist Green Book in Western North Carolina with our guest speaker, Lisa Withers. So I'd love for folks to go ahead and type into the chat and let us know where you are Zooming from, where you're joining us from today. Like to see who all is with us. So in the meantime, I'll let you know where the Swannanoa Valley Museum is. Some of you have been to the museum and know where we are, and some of you may be new to it. We're located in Western North Carolina, just east of Asheville, North Carolina, in the town of Black Mountain. And our valley, for which we're named, is about 20 miles wide, and it's formed by the drainage of the Swannanoa River, which joins the French Broad River in Asheville, west of us. And our museum is dedicated to interpreting the history, culture, and ecology of the Swannanoa Valley, as well as our Southern Appalachian region more broadly. Right now, I want to mention that we do have a new exhibit going on in our museum, and it's celebrating 100 years of the Black Mountain Firehouse and the history of the Black Mountain Fire Department. We're open Thursday through Saturday from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. Masks are required for everyone, and we would love for you to come and see what we've got going on right now. So let's check and see where some folks are joining us from. Got Raleigh, awesome. East Tennessee, wonderful. Black Mountain, Asheville, Weaverville, Black Mountain, Tampa, Florida. Awesome. Well, thanks to everyone who is with us today. I'll go ahead and do our land acknowledgement. For those who are new to this, land acknowledgements are a way of recognizing the fact that here in the United States, we are all standing on indigenous land. So we at the Swannanoa Valley Museum respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of the Ani Gaduagi, otherwise known as the Cherokee or the people of Gadua. I'm conducting this event from my home in Asheville, North Carolina, which has traditionally been known to the Cherokee as Togiasti, meaning the place where they raced. So land acknowledgements are a small part of much bigger work that's needed to restore sacred lands and honor treaty rights. So during this presentation today, we would love to hear your questions. And when you have a question, please go ahead and type it into the chat. Ms. Withers is planning on stopping at certain points during her presentation to answer questions, and I'll relay them to her from the chat. And we'll also have a more formal Q&A at the end of the presentation. So I'll go ahead and introduce Ms. Withers, and I'll hand things over to her. So Lisa R. Withers is a doctoral candidate in the Public History program at North Carolina State University. Her research examines the people associated with the Negro Motorist Green Book along U.S. Highway 29 and U.S. Highway 70 in North Carolina. Lisa's research also investigates how the historical publication can be utilized by cultural heritage and museum professionals in facilitating public dialogues about the Jim Crow era in North Carolina as modern society continues to grapple with the legacies of Jim Crow. Previously, Lisa worked as the research historian for the North Carolina Green Book Project with the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission and as the curator for the Claiming the Past, Directing the Future, a community-based cultural heritage project in Belize, Central America, with North Carolina State University. Lisa's professional experiences include working in university archives, historic house museums, historic sites, local history museums, and teaching undergraduate history courses. So let's give a silent round of applause for Lisa, and I'll hand it over to her.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah, for that wonderful introduction. And also thank you for inviting me to join everyone here today to talk about the Green Book in North Carolina. I know originally it was going to be Western North Carolina, but as mentioned in my bio, I have restricted my case study to be along Highway 70 in Asheville is the main municipality, if you will, along that highway. And so we'll be focusing mostly on Asheville. And so what I'm going to go ahead and do is share my screen, and I'm going to go ahead and get started. And so in this age of Zoom, hopefully we can now get it going. There we go. Hit share. Oh, can everyone see the PowerPoint screen? Yes? Okay, good. I'm getting a thumbs up. Awesome. All right. And we see the title slide. Make sure. Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. Just want to get the confirmation because I have a different view. All right. So, once again, good evening. As mentioned before, my name is Lisa R. Withers, and I'm really excited to spend this evening with everyone in the Swannanoa Valley Museum and talking a little bit about the Negro Motorist Green Book. And so on the screen, you see an overview of what I plan to talk about during our time together. And so the Green Book has gained more public awareness over the recent years, particularly after the feature film came out in 2018. And so while I'm thinking that most people have probably heard about the topic and the publication, I still want to start off with a brief description as far as what it is and what is it. After that, I plan to progress on and talking more specifically about some things that I've found related to the listings in Asheville, North Carolina. And as Sarah mentioned, conclude with having a Q&A session. And I would like to reiterate what Sarah mentioned. I know it's difficult in the Zoom environment these days to try to be interactive, but try to break it up a little bit. So if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat and Sarah will relay them, and hopefully we can interject some question and answer and help break it up a little bit. Because even when I was teaching, I didn't like lecturing, and so I can only imagine even through the Zoom environment, it, you know, some people may love it, others don't, but we try to mix it up a little bit in the best way possible. And so, if we're all ready to go, let's dig in. So, the Green Book, what is it? So I'm going to start by giving a short definition of what is the Green Book. Generally, the Green Book is framed as a historical publication that lists restaurants, nightclubs, hotels, tourist homes, beauty parlors, barbershops, tailors, and gas stations, and where it was known where African Americans could receive service without encountering racial discrimination while traveling. The general narrative that is often shared is that Victor Green was an African American postal worker based out of Harlem, New York, who started the Green Book in 1936 and is a publication that was in continuous circulation, more or less, for 30 years, with the last edition being a biennial edition in 1966-1967. And this publication main goal was to help African Americans travel safely. Now, the physical book itself was small, approximately 5 inches in width, 6 3/4 inches in length, and a ½ inch thick. Now, being a small booklet was beneficial because that meant that it could easily fit into a handbag, a carry-on case, or even the glove compartment of a car. So that's the Green Book in a nutshell in kind of its physical dimension. Let's take a look at the inside. So I first would like to address the listings. When we think of the way the Green Book is often framed, the popular narrative, it tends to give the impression that this publication was static, that all it did was list safe spaces for African Americans, and that pretty much stayed the same during the 30 years that it was published. But what I would like to point out is that Victor Green changed the guide over time. It was a dynamic publication. Victor Green was a postal worker, so let's keep in mind he was not a publisher by trade or profession. He saw a need and an opportunity, and he took it. So when you think about it from our 21st century mindset, you could say that the Green Book in some ways was a civic-minded side hustle. It was sold in the early years of 1930s. It was about 50 cents per copy, and it did increase in price over time. I believe the latter editions were about $1.50 by the time it ended circulation in the 1960s. And so when we think about the Green Book as a civic minded side hustle, it makes a lot of sense that the publication constantly changed as Green gained more experience in getting the publication out to its intended audience and better meeting their needs. And so you can see an example of the change in the listings on the screen. Early edition, like the one on the left, featured the listings by state, then by city or town, then by category headings such as restaurants or filling station. And what you see on the left side of the screen is a 1947 edition on the Green Book. As time went on, the organization of the publication changed to arrange the listings only by state, then by city and town. It totally removed the subject heading categories altogether. And you can see this on the right side of the screen in the 1963-1964 biennial edition. And it should also be noted by the 1950s and by the 1960s, beauty parlors and barbershops were no longer listed in the publication at all. And so this is one of the first key features that I would want to mention as far as the content on the inside of the Green Book is the listing of all the different places that were included for African Americans for safe travel. Now, the second thing that I want to bring to everyone's attention about the Green Book and what's on the inside is its geographic scope. And so it is often assumed that the Green Book, it was a publication intended for the South or the Southeastern United States. However, flipping through the pages inside the Green Book reveals that its listings included almost all of the continental United States. And so it is true that the Southeastern US as a region had visible signage and Jim Crow laws. However, the Northeast, the Midwest, the Southwest, and the Pacific Northwest also had their own racialized rules and customs, often unwritten, which I would say potentially made travel more dangerous. The Midwest, in particular, was known for having sundown towns, or places where African Americans were not allowed and certainly not accepted after dark. Even internationally, there are mixed stories of positive and negative experiences from both more affluent African Americans who travel abroad, as well as from military veterans. When we read the autobiographies and memoirs of individuals such as activist Mary Church Terrell or writer Claude McKay, they mention a sense of freedom in traveling to other countries as they were able to escape the racism experienced in America. However, there are also accounts from African Americans such as George Schuler, a journalist for the Pittsburgh Courier, a national African American newspaper, who discussed feeling discriminated against or treated as an oddity when traveling abroad. And so, based on these accounts, it is understandable why there may also be international listings in the Green Book as well as other regions. And so on the screen, you see there are 3 pages from the publication. The far left is from the 1960 edition. It is just an example showing some listings from North Carolina. And at the bottom, you see North Dakota is the next state that was listed. The middle is also from the 1960 edition. And the page on the far right is from the 1966-1967 biennial edition. And these 2 pages give an example of some of the international listings included in the publication. So the third and final aspect of the Green Book content that I want to highlight as far as talking about what it is and what's in it are the essays and the helpful tips that are found inside the publication. So the Green Book, it did not simply list restaurants or hotels, etc. The editors also gave driving advice, plus helpful information on the different models of cars and traveling. One way the Green Book functioned was as a source of encouragement for African Americans to travel, and this aspect of publication is apparent in the essays focusing on the cultural attractions. And so you can see this particularly on the left side, on the right side, excuse me, of the screen. In several editions, there are essays on certain cities with a description about what the location has to offer. One thing to keep in mind is that these essays seem really practical, not just for safety, but also because they overlap with the golden age of vacationing in America, a period in which scholar Susan Ruff notes as being between 1945 and 1970. And so in several ways, the Green Book did held multiple roles. It not only listed places, but it showed you places to go and encouraged travel as well amongst the African American community. And so during the 30 years that the Green Book was published, over 300 entries were cumulatively listed for the state of North Carolina. Majority were in urban areas. For example, Charlotte had the most with 53 locations, followed by Wilmington at 50. Raleigh and Durham each had 38. Fayetteville had 27. Winston-Salem had 18. Greensboro had 14, and Asheville had 12. While not all Green Book listings are located within the state's more urban areas, not every county was represented for North Carolina. Travelers will often submit the names of places to Victor Green, who published them in the booklet. In later years, Green would reach out to businesses known to catering to African American travelers and urge them to advertise in the Green Book. Crowdsourcing and advertisement sales were two primary ways the Green Book grew from a publication focusing on the New York metropolitan area to an annual publication featuring nearly all 50 states plus countries abroad. So, as mentioned earlier, I wanted to begin our time together by covering key aspects of the Green Book as a publication, what it is and what is found inside. And so, with that, I would like to pause and just ask if there are any questions before moving on.
We did have one question in the chat. Uh, Larry asked, "It would seem useful to break it down by category within cities. Um, why do you think Mr. Green dropped that?"
That is something I'm not 100% sure about. At this time, there is not any known organizational records that we can look through to kind of get a sense as to exactly some of the rationale as to why. And that is one of those that falls under is the editorial choice. And so it could be that they had got feedback and said that wasn't useful, or perhaps they at the time thought it was more helpful to change the way they were listed. I will also note though, even though they dropped the heading, sometimes that heading was incorporated into the name. So for example, for Asheville, you have the Booker T. Washington. In early editions, it would be under the hotel category. But in later years, you'll see it listed as the Booker T. Washington Hotel. So even though they dropped the category, they would still incorporate like the names like tavern, restaurant, like service station into the name. And also in later years, you do start to see more advertisements. So when I say advertisement, sometimes the listing, instead of it being, if I can go back, hopefully if you see it, so instead of it being like here, like just Savoy tourist homes, in some places in North Carolina, they would actually have like actual ads where they would show like a picture of the house. Like actually, I have here you go. Here's this example in Wilmington. Like you have Payne's Tourist Home. It's one of the tourist homes in Wilmington, and you can see it's in more of an ad-like format versus here at the bottom where you have the rest of them for this year that just gives the name and an address. And so not able to give an exact answer as to why they made the change, but we do know that the change did happen and that there are other ways and how they incorporate some of that similar information in this formatting.
Yeah. And we had another question here. Leah asked, was the Green Book typically sold at newsstands or did one need to special order it?
Not necessarily special order. And so you could write in and request, which was common because this is also the era of catalogs. You know, I do remember catalogs. I'm young, but not kind of that young. So I do remember catalogs. So you could write in and order in. As the Green Book started to gain more awareness and circulation, Victor Green was really successful in having a partnership with Esso, which is now Exxon Mobil. And so also Esso is one of the bigger companies that is recognized as having being one among the first to have to hire African American marketing and having a team of people who that's what they did. They really thought about how do we best market to and get African Americans to purchase and buy the product. And so through ESO and ESO service stations, that was one way, a key way that green books were circulated when people didn't already know about it, to purchase it through outright. Also, some of the green book businesses had them. And so I had the opportunity to meet the descendants for one of the listings in Raleigh. And it was really interesting in talking to this individual. This descendant recalled working at the hotel. Her aunt owned the hotel at the time. And she lived there with her aunt, and of course would help out, as me recall growing up, we had chores, we had to do things to help out wherever we were living. And she shared the memory of remembering having to pass out booklets to customers as they checked in and checked out. And we were having the conversation, she was like, I don't think I really realized the importance of handing that booklet out to people at the time. And so that's also another example. I'm not sure how frequently that happened, but I thought that was really, really interesting, especially, decades later, hearing that story and that being one way that sometimes customers may have gotten a copy of the green book. So there were all kinds of a variety of ways.
That's really, yeah, that's really neat. I'll give you one more question and then we'll keep moving and hopefully we can keep getting to folks' questions here. Tom asks, when Green reached out to advertisers, was his contact list compiled from suggestions previously submitted by travelers, or did he have any strategy for expanding his listings?
He did have one, and so I've been in the process of reading. So in the past 2 years, there actually now have been books written about the Green Book now. When I first started my research, there were several journal articles, but it was still a topic that was just now beginning to catch the renewed interest of scholars. And so now there are now 3 books available. And if you remind me at the end, I can come back and share those titles. But in one of the books, I remember reading that eventually Victor Green was able to have a few agents. And so, in addition to it being crowdsourced by people being able to submit names and things, there are also agents. These agents tend to be people who travel. I think one was someone who worked at a school, but in many of our predominantly African American schools, they had choirs and bands that traveled a lot. So I'm based in north of Greensboro, North Carolina, where we have what used to be a prestigious boarding school called Palmer Memorial Institute. Is now a historic site in North Carolina, but they had their own choir or singing group that went around and toured, because that was one of the ways how they could raise money and fund. And there are other schools where this happened as well. And if I remember correctly from reading, one of these individuals who worked at school was also doubled as an agent and would also work to help submit names, make recommendations. That was one of the other ways. I can go if Sarah would remind me. Sorry, I don't have my a pen and paper to write. I can go back and look back at some of the sources and just see what people have also written as far as actual strategies, in addition to intentional strategies, in addition to people submitting names. But then also Victor Green, he was resourceful himself because he was a postal worker. And when he first started the Green Booklet, the first edition is on the New York metropolitan area by itself. And so a lot of that was crowdsourced by other postal workers making recommendation as well. And so he first tapped into his own network, and then it kind of snowballed and grew from there as well. So I hope that answers the question. And again, I can go back and look as far as what other people have already said for his actual strategic way, but a lot of it did grow organically through word of mouth. And word of mouth was very strong and very common way information is spread.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, you want to proceed? Keep going.
Sure can. Let me make sure I get back to the right slide. All right. So as I mentioned, I did want to be sure that we all started together on the same page as far as what is the Green Book. As I mentioned, it is something that has gained wider awareness in society, but just in case if there's someone who may have never heard of it before, wanted to be sure and start there with it. But I do want to shift into some of the research that I have been engaging with. And so, as Sarah mentioned in the introduction, in my current research, I am interested in the places and the people listed in the publication in the state of North Carolina and examining them within their local context. And so, the state of North Carolina has over 300 listings, way too many to do in a dissertation. So, I've had to figure out a way to narrow it down. And so one way that I've done that is by following a potential route someone would have traveled um, during the time that the Green Book was published. And so I chose two highways in the state of North Carolina, and you can see them on the map on the screen. So this map, it comes from the Department of Transportation. It is a primary highway system map from 1940. What you see highlighted in purple is US 70 at the time. It starts in the Outer Banks. It winds its way going east to west in North Carolina through to the Tennessee border. And then what you see in blue is US Highway 29 running north to south. And so it goes from the Virginia border, winds its way down through the Piedmont, hitting Charlotte before eventually it goes down into South Carolina. And so there are I actually created a master table of all the different highways and things. I ended up choosing these two to hopefully get a good cross section. It's not the north, south, east, west with the most, but it's high in numbers. And also, given the proximity going through the roughly the middle of the state, it allows me to hit both urban and rural, and that was something I really wanted to do. And just myself having grown up in the rural area of the state, knowing that there are some really important people and things that happen that unfortunately don't get talked about a lot because it's rural. And so I wanted to be able to include that geographic diversity in my work as well. And so while only looking at two highways does not capture the full story of the Green Book for North Carolina, it is a starting point. And so, as I mentioned before, when it comes to the western part of the state, Highway 70, it goes through Asheville. And so I will be spending the remainder of the presentation really just focusing on Asheville. Majority of what's listed in the Green Book are in Asheville. However, there are two that are outside. There is one in Hendersonville and one in Lenoir as well. But the remaining are in Asheville. So this does cover the bulk of what's listed for this region of the state. And so the table on the screen, I acknowledge it is a lot of text, but I'm going to kind of point out some things about it, and we'll also pause a little bit in case anyone was interested in kind of looking over it. But the table that you see on the screen, it was compiled by going through each available edition of the Green Book digitized by the Newark Public Library and noting what was listed in each edition for Asheville. And so as you can see from the table in the years listed column, that what was listed in the Green Book for Asheville, it varied in each edition depending on the year. So you can't go through each year and expect it to be the same or to continuously grow. It may have 3 or 4 in one edition, 5 or 6 in another, maybe the same 5 or 6 in one year, and then like a totally different list in the next year. And so what you see on the screen is when you look at all 30 years the Green Book was published, this what ultimately was published for Asheville. Now, the table does include addresses, and these addresses were ones that I've managed to pinpoint. The Green Book does not always put like actual like street number, street name. Sometimes it's just an intersection, sometimes it's just a road. And so what I have been able to do is use a variety of sources to pinpoint exactly where a business was, and that's what you see included in the table. And I also included addresses for that business when it was published in the Green Book. So an example of that is Dewdrop Inn Barbershop. When you look in the Green Book in the two editions that appears in, both editions say 4 Eagle Street. However, in 1961 was actually when Vernon Miller moved. And so the second time it was published, he was actually at the South Market Street location, not at Eagle Street. So just to kind of explain why that one has 2 addresses there. I've also made an effort to try and identify the primary or the principal people associated with each listing. And so for some of these listings, management did change over the years. It was kind of like one person like every year, every 2 years. But generally, there are one or two primary individuals that are able to pinpoint and identify. So that's who you see in the far right column, or the main people identified for each listing. And so, as I mentioned before, there's just a lot of text, and so just gonna spend a moment here. Maybe do one more question from moving on, unless y'all are good.
Yeah, someone had a good question looking at these listings. Sam asked, I noticed a distinct gap in listings from 1941 to 46. Since that was during the war, were there issues those years?
I don't think so. I think generally World War II is attributed when they stopped publication. Also, there hasn't seemed to be an edition for 1958 that has surfaced anywhere, and so I think that is something that is still speculating. Is where was there editions published at that time, or is it a natural break that happened?
Were there, I guess I have a follow-up question, were there just some years that just weren't, when Green wasn't able to publish for one reason or another, or?
Either that, or an edition hasn't shown up yet. I still have hope that in someone's attic somewhere, or in their basement somewhere, or chest of drawers, edition will come up. To my knowledge, the most complete collection is what's digitized through the New York Public Library. Um, I am not aware of other full like collections besides that one, but as I mentioned, you never know what may turn up somewhere. A lot of times, I ask my parents all the time, we're not trying to keep everything, but before you throw stuff away, let's think about, hey, would this be valuable 50 years from now to tell the story of our family or things of that nature? So, I mean, that's part of the reason why I hesitate to say, like, no, they did not publish, because that is something that I still am not sure about. And there have been books that have just recently come out, and I'm working my way through them. I'm not sure if anyone else has already been able to determine 100% whether or not if it was not just simply not published, or just an edition for that year hasn't come to light yet.
Gotcha, gotcha. Thanks.
Mhm. All right, so we are going to keep it moving. And so, with this listing, or this table of listings for Asheville, I would like to spend the rest of the time really discussing more specifically some of the commonalities. So, I will be talking about these not individually, but more so in groups of different things that found in common, either about the listings themselves or even about the people at time, and share a few insight about the places in Asheville that are included in the publication. So the first aspect that I wanted to share is this observation, especially about the hotels, and that the hotels listed in the Green Book, not just in Asheville, but also in other places in North Carolina, they tended to be community spaces. They were not just for people passing through or visiting, but they were gathering places for the Black community for social, civic, and professional events, as well as providing housing options for community members. So there were three hotels listed for Asheville in the Green Book. You had the Booker T. Washington, the Savoy, and the James Keys. Now, the Booker T. Washington and the James Keys were actually the same building on Southside Avenue. It's just when the next major tenant or management came in, they changed the name, but still the same building, same location. And this hotel actually existed for a number of years before 1940, the first time it was published in the Green Book, but under different management, and as with James Keys, with different names as well. But it was a long-standing hotel within Asheville's African American community. And as evidenced by the newspaper advertisements on the screen, both the Booker T. Washington Hotel and the James Keys Hotel, under both names and management, it was the location to see live performance of popular musicians of the day. And so in one, we have one of Zach White, who was a popular musician. The other one, you have the Darlings of Rhythm, who were very popular in the 1940s, 1950s. John Grant, who grew up in the South Side community of Asheville and was interviewed in the early 2000s, he recalled the James Keys Hotel as a place where he went to listen to big band play, and later 45s or vinyl records, purchased from Crest. It was considered a local club or hangout spot for music lovers. And so, in addition to music, hotels functioned as an event space. And this is also seen in other city or towns with the Green Book listings, such as the Biltmore Hotel in Durham and the Arcade Hotel in Raleigh. And so, even outside of it being a music venue, hotels were often called upon to provide lodging. There you go. Forgot to tell myself to move forward. There you go. To provide lodging for meeting spaces for conferences, or there were spaces for transactions. So, for example, on the screen on the left side, you see a flyer for a conference. Is for the Southern Regional Conference of the Child Welfare League of America. And it is small, but on the bottom, where you see in the box, it gives recommendation for hotel reservations. And the first two is the Battery Park Hotel in Asheville and the George Vanderbilt Hotel. But then in the third column, it lists the James Key Hotel with Negros in parentheses to indicate for all of our African American attendees to this conference, this is where you're going to go to secure lodgings while you're in Asheville for this conference. And so very much how we think about hotels today. They function in a very similar way. But in addition to lodging, they also had events, hosted event spaces for organizations. And so two examples, one is in 1943, the North Carolina State Beauticians Association, they had their annual meeting at the Booker T. Washington Hotel. And actually one of the beauticians who listed in the Green Book, Lucille Butler, she operated the Madame Butler Beauty Salon. She was president of the local union that was hosting the state conference that year at the Booker T. Washington Hotel. So seeing a connection between two Green Book listings within the city. And then we see another example in 1965 when the Asheville branch of the NAACP, they had an event there and they crowned their Mother of the Year at a fashion show, and that was held at the James Keys Hotel. And if we look to the right, some of the advertisements found in newspapers in the right, the Savoy Hotel was often listed for a variety of events as a place to purchase tickets locally. That's in addition to Madame Butler's Beauty Salon and the Palace Grill, which you also see listed on the advertisement. Both of these were also Green Book listings as well, where you can go where there's an event going on, you need to purchase tickets in advance, you could go to these places to buy your tickets. You can also stay at these hotels as well. And this is something that I think in modern day times we don't quite think about as much. I know for my generation, probably not as frequently. But in going through city directories, they illustrate the number of people who are residing in the hotels on more of a longer term basis than just the 1 or 2 night stay or week stay if you're traveling through town. And I do have at the bottom right an advertisement found in a newspaper to rent the rooms or the apartments that were included in the Booker T. Washington Hotel. And at this time, Ira Angel was the manager of the space. And so, and another example of people living there, I found Mason James, who eventually became the owner operator of the James Keys Hotel. He actually resided at the Savoy from 1939 to 1943 before he ended up buying his home over on Crescent Street. And so one of the things to notice about some of the Green Book listing, not just in Asheville, but in other states when it comes to hotels, they tend to be community spaces and function in a variety of different ways as community spaces, in addition to being places where people can stay as they're traveling through. Okay, making sure my computer. Okay, so the next thing that I would like to address are some of the networks that are identified between Green Book listings. And so it is true that many Green Book listings were individual businesses, sole proprietorships or partnerships, but other listings and people affiliated with the listings tend to be part of larger pre-existing networks. And so one example I've already alluded to with the hotels as an established network is the Chitlin Circuit, or a collection of venues that cater to African American musicians and their audiences. So not only were hotels often the location of music venues, hotel owners and operators, they tended to double as booking agencies or promote music promoters. So for example, Mason James at the James Keys Hotel, He also had his own booking agency as well that he operated out of the hotel. Now, the YWCA, it represents another network that's often found associated with the Green Book, and its inclusion is I find really interesting because it helps to expand the African American travel narrative that's associated with the Green Book and going beyond the pursuit or fight for leisure travel. And so, as many people may already be familiar, the YMCA and the YWCA were national or are still are a national organization with branches in local communities. And so, the Phyllis Wheatley branch was the African American YWCA branch in Asheville, and it was listed at two locations over the 30-year period that the Green Book was published, and Asheville was included. First, its College Street location, and then when it moved over to Ashland Avenue. Now, the YWCA, it conducted work to help the community. And within a collection of oral histories found at the local library, there are recollections of the YWCA having various spaces for travelers. One Asheville resident recalled that the YWCA building on College Street, it had offices on the first floor, and on the second floor were rooms for outer town African American women since, and I give a direct quote, the the availability and certainty of obtaining a respectable home was important to all Black job seekers, end quote. And so likewise, another community member also recalled the YWCA providing housing for African American women who are looking for work in Asheville. And so essentially, as women were coming to Asheville from the more rural areas in Western North Carolina looking for work, the YWCA would provide a temporary residence as these women were looking for jobs. And in general, YMCAs and YWCAs were known to have lodging spaces that were used by travelers. Another example would be the YMCA in Raleigh, North Carolina. It is also another Y that is listed in the Green Book for the state of North Carolina as well. Okay, and I already talked about that. And so with the YWCA is one example of the Green Book being connected to an organization with a larger network. I did not find an example of this in Asheville, but in other parts of North Carolina, I've also found several individuals who were very strongly connected with the NAACP, another national organization with local branches, especially that was very active in the spread of information as well. So that's another network that you see that's also connected with the Green Book through the activities and the lives of the people who are affiliated with those listings across the state of North Carolina. So another commonality that I wanted to point out is that Green Book proprietors, they tended to be active within the local community and their profession. So I mentioned in other parts of the state, I've seen multiple people who are involved with the NAACP. And in the previous slide, I talked about the YWCA as an organization. And so one person that I would like to point out is Ms. Laura Jo Foster, who operated Foster's Tourist Home on Cleveland Avenue in Asheville. And she was a member of the YWCA, and her husband, Samuel Foster, was on the board of the Market Street YMCA for over 50 years. Mrs. Foster was also involved with the Asheville Colored Hospital, and she was a member of the Ladies Auxiliary Chapter of the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters, Pullman Car Porters. On the screen is an image of the Ladies Auxiliary, and according to the caption, Ms. Foster is in the middle of the group, fourth from the left in the picture. Now, I mentioned Lucille G. Butler, who was the owner of Madame Butler's Beauty Salon. I mentioned her earlier with the hotels and that the Booker T. Washington was the place where the state organization met when they came to Asheville. You see, there is a newspaper article on the right side of the screen, and in the newspaper article, she is noted as being the president of the local union for beauticians in Asheville as well. And this is another example of people affiliated with the Green Book. Oftentimes, they didn't just operate their Green Book business, but they are also involved in the community, whether through community organizations or within their professional organization as well. And so while going newspaper articles, I found a really interesting story about the 1947 season opener of the Negro Southern Baseball League between the Asheville Blues and the Chattanooga Choo Choos. Very interesting team name, I might say. So in the article, it included a list of businesses that offered prizes to Asheville players. including several businesses that were listed in the Green Book. And I just wanted to share what they were. And so among those offering prizes, HB Kilgo, who was a barber at Wilson's Barbershop, offered $5 to the player who got the first homer. The Palace Grill offered a chicken dinner to the player reaching first base first. The James Keys Hotel offered $5 for the first stolen base. Madam Butler's Beauty Salon offered a Marcel wave for the first run of the game. Vernon Miller, who operated the Dewdrop Inn Barbershop, he offered $3 to the player who had the first triple and $4 for the first home run of the game. And then the Savoy Hotel was listed as offering additional prizes to the players. So I'm not sure how much more involved with your community you can get, and definitely helping encourage your local minor league team come out strong in the season opener. And so before I move on, I just want to take a moment to pause. Are there any questions to address, or keep going?
There's one question that goes back to the first portion of your presentation, but Barbara was wondering, was the Green Book free?
No. I mean, you could possibly at times get it for free. So like I imagine in remembering the conversation I had with the descendant of someone who remembered one of the hotels in Raleigh and like passed them out. Sometimes people could get them for free if you knew someone who had a copy and they gave them to you. If you're getting them from Victor Green himself or from the Victor Green Publishing Company, in the earlier years, it was around 50 cents, 50 to 75 cents. Over time, it did start to cost more. I believe by the time the Green Book stopped publication in 1967, it was about $1.25, $1.50 for a copy. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, so I am looking at my time, starting to run short, so I'm just going to briefly go through some of the remaining things that I've observed. And so among several of the Green Book proprietors, many of them demonstrated entrepreneurial spirit. I'm just going to point to the slide in that they did not just operate the Green Book business. Some of them had multiple business ventures. And I often wonder, like, I don't know how y'all had time to do all this, but it's a lot. And so just noticing like Mr. Angel, he had 4 businesses, the James had 4, and Mr. Miller, he also had 4. And this is something that I have noticed in other parts of the state as well, a very strong entrepreneurial spirit that you see in people who are very business minded and they operate and have multiple businesses within that particular city or town. And then another commonality is that, and it probably is unsurprising that for some of the people affiliated with the Green Book, many of them travel themselves, whether it's for their jobs or things they've done in their lifetime, or they moved as part of this era. The Green Book was published during the Great Migration. And oftentimes we think of the Great Migration as people moving south, north, and west, but sometimes it may not be to another region, but even just to another state. And so I have listed on the screen some of the examples that I found of people moving either from one state to another or from one region to another. For example, like the Lynns, they when Wilson's Barbershop was listed in the Green Book, it was under their owner and management, and they came from Ohio. Well, Mrs. Lynn was from Mississippi, went to Ohio. They got married in Ohio and then moved down to North Carolina. And so kind of example of just some of the travel back and forth, and that, you know, the Green Book, when we talk about travel, we often talk about the people that they started traveling. But when we look at the people who operated some of these listings, they too themselves oftentimes did travel as well. And so, and the pictures on the screen, and just thinking about traveling, you know, and people doing their traveling, of the 12 entities for Asheville, only 2 physical structures are still standing all intact. And so that's what you see on the screen. The top is Foster's Tourist Home. That is what it looked like as of 2019. Of course, it could have changed in that time since then, but 2019, that's what it looked like. And then at the bottom is the J.A. Wilson building, which is where Wilson's Barbershop was located. And I believe a restaurant is there now. And so but those are the only 2 out of the 12 that the whole building is still intact. And if you're ever on Eagle and Market Street, the whole section of Eagle Street where the AJ Wilson is located. The front exterior of those buildings is still standing, but they've redone that section to be a multi-use commercial mixed-use building at that time, even though the front facade is still standing. And so, because I'm short on time, I am just going to go a little bit more quickly. These are two more things to mention.
Lisa,
Mm-hmm.
just so you know, you have until 7:30 at least, because the event is going until 7:45.
Thank
So
you.
yeah,
Okay, I
so
did forget about that.
don't.
Okay.
Oh, no worries, no worries. So no need to rush if you don't want to.
Did want to be sure I stay within my allotted time frame.
Totally. Thanks.
Although before I was going faster, so I thought I need to slow down. So how it goes. But the next to last thing that I wanted to share is kind of the thing that I don't want to say downfall, that may not be the right word, but some of the things that you come across with a crowdsourced publication. That's what the things that you come across with a crowdsourced publication. And so of the 12 listings, two were caused me to scratch my head a little bit. It's like, where are these places and who are the people? I had a hard time finding them, but I did find them. And so the first one is Wilkins Garage. I put on the screen here, I don't know if you can see my cursor. This is the listing when it was published in 1940. It only appeared, I believe, in that one edition of the Green Book. And as you see, it just says Eagle and Market Street. Doesn't say where, just somewhere along that intersection. However, when looking at the city directory, no Wilkins Garage, no auto repair shop. There are a few service stations, none of them are Wilkins, but they're also a little too far away from the intersection to really be strong candidates. And so I had an opportunity to meet a community elder. And that elder mentioned that there was an auto repair shop on the back side of the buildings along this particular section of Eagle Street. So like, okay, so there's definitely an auto repair shop there. So then the next step was to look at Sanborn maps. And it's on the Sanborn map, which is what you see on the screen, where I finally found there was here, and I have it highlighted in green. They have on the back side of these businesses on industry, you see auto repair. And so being that I knew it was there, I decided to go the other direction in the city directories. And I finally found it in 1938. And there was a gentleman by the name of Samuel D. Wilkins. He was listed in the city directory as operating an auto repair shop in the space behind 38 South Market, which would be here. So this would be 38 South Market would be the entrance to this lot, this back lot, and then the repair shop would be on the back side of these buildings on Eagle Street. So unfortunately, Samuel D. Wilkins, he was only found one time in the city directories in 1938. Was not able to find him again, going forwards in time or backwards in time. And I'm still looking for him. But I bring up this example in that Wilkins Garage was listed in the Green Book for about 4 years. But in the years that it was listed, the business did not exist in reality at that time. And so, although according to a community member, even though not listed in the city directory, apparently there were others who had a auto shop back in that area. So hopefully if you travel there, someone will point you in the right way to go. The other example that I wanted to kind of just share about researching these places and trying to figure out where they are and who the people were. The second one is Jameson. And so you can see here in this advertisement, in this listing in the 1954 edition, you have Jameson is listed under barbershops at 211 Ashland Avenue. And this is in the 1954 edition. And so if you go to the city directory for Asheville in 1954, what is listed is not anyone by the name of Jameson or any kind of beauty or barbershop, but rather the parsonage for Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church with Reverend John W. White and his spouse Ethel as the residents. And so I wasn't able to make a connection between the Green Book listing and the person who supposedly operated that business until going back 20 years. And so I finally found an Andrew Jameson at 211 Ashland Avenue. He first appeared in 1930 at that address, and then his spouse Daisy Jameson appears in 1935. But not until 1937 when the city directories note Daisy Jameson as operating a beauty parlor in the home. And she does this from 1937 through 1939. And so it should be noted during this time that city directories also noted multiple people living in the household. And the 1940 US Census notes that there are several lodgers living at 211 Ashland Avenue with the Jamesons. By 1941, the city directories no longer list a beauty parlor, but list it as Jameson Guest House. And then unfortunately, the Jamesons disappear from Asheville. But I did get one sighting of them again, the primary source record, and it seems like they moved from Asheville to Cleveland, Ohio in 1942. And so with the Green Book, kind of with the sharing of those two examples, the Green Book, it was a really important publication. It served a very important purpose for the African American community. But you also have to remember that it was crowdsourced. And so there are oftentimes some listings. There are two in Asheville. There are other examples in other parts of the state where someone submitted something. It was accurate at one time, but unfortunately, it no longer existed when it appeared in the publication. And so the last commonality or observation that I wanted to mention when it comes to Asheville's Green Book listings, and this also goes into thinking how we think about the Green Book. I mentioned earlier, I started off our time together talking about the listings. And in the past 2 or 3 years, in doing this work and having conversations with community members, oftentimes it's expressed that the Green Book seems to be talked about or framed as this definitive guide. And it wasn't, and I don't think we can. Oftentimes I've been asked, was so-and-so place listed, whether that be a business or a community? And unfortunately, oftentimes the answer was no. And there's really not a reason as to why they were not listed. We could speculate, but we don't know why. But I think something that comes from, especially an effort to map some of the places, is another way of potentially thinking about the Green Book. And that is, rather than thinking about a list of safe spaces, maybe perhaps a better way to think of it as entry points to the Black community and answering a bigger question, not where can I go get food, gas, get my car repaired, but where are the communities more broadly defined that will be willing to help me find the services, the goods, the information that I'm going to need. And so I apologize. I realize this map is not the best. It's an early prototype. And this is as far as I could zoom in and still get all 12 places. So I understand, I acknowledge it's not the best. But I still decided to share it because I do think that hopefully it illustrates a bigger point that I'm trying to make. Is that when you look at broadly from an aerial view where these places were located, look at they're in different parts of the city, but all of these are also different pockets of historically Black communities. So you have Eagle and Market Street, where the bulk of them are, which is the historically Black business district. You have Clingman Avenue over here, which is a historically African American residential district. Same thing for Ashland Avenue, and then South Side, which unfortunately most of it was torn down during urban renewal. And so also looking at it geographically also helps to encourage us to think of new ways to think of it, not just as listings, but as entry points. And entry points that would be of importance to travelers as they're going into a new place, into a new location. So even, for example, with Jameson, they try to go to Jameson and they can find it there, they would still find themselves on Ashland Avenue, where all along the street you would have other African American community members who would be willing to help them out. And same thing for Wilkins. You may have been trying to find Wilkins for car garage, couldn't maybe find them right away, but you're all along Eagle Market Street, but there are also plenty of other African American businesses there and someone who could help you find your way if you needed to. And so with that, I know the hour went by very quickly, but I'm going to end on that note. And if there's any further questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you so much for joining us. It has been a pleasure and a joy.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Yeah, I appreciate you showing that map at the end because I think it's really helpful for folks who may not be as familiar with Asheville. You can really see where a lot of those African American communities have been located in Asheville. And for those who are really familiar with that part of the city, it's interesting to think about what parts still have African American communities and what parts have basically um, where those communities have in some ways like been pretty actively disassembled by the city through urban renewal. Um, and those locations being there in the Green Book like help to give a sense of like what those full communities used to look like. Um, yeah, there are several questions I can get into here. Tom asked, is there any particular factor that would have attracted African American entrepreneurs to Asheville from other southern states, such as Mississippi?
Any particular factor for an entrepreneur specifically?
Or perhaps more widely, just why folks during the Great Migration might have been attracted to moving to the area?
That is a question I'm actually answering myself because I'm not from that part of the state. I'm from the Piedmont. And so one of the things that I have been learning a lot about my home state is some of the other regions. And so I do imagine that it could be part of the more generic factors that we tend to think about, whether it be an opportunity, if they already have family living there, especially oftentimes when one person moved, it doesn't take long for others. I know here in Greensboro, for one of the Green Book owners, I found him in the 1940 census, and he's living with an aunt, uncle, and a whole bunch of cousins. And when you look in the 1940 census, it's interesting because they have a column where were we living in 1935, and all of them were in Alabama. Everything's like one came and they all came. And so unfortunately, I don't think I can answer specifically why Asheville and why for entrepreneurs, but I can imagine like for many other people, either family or there are particular opportunities that presented themselves and they thought Asheville was a good place to come. And
Yeah,
so I hope as I continue to learn more about the Asheville's local history, that is something I'm trying to keep in mind and learn more about, and hopefully, um, I do with the Fosters. Something I thought, and I never realized Asheville was such a railroad town, and so it was interesting. But the more I thought about it, it wasn't as surprising to find out that Samuel Clinton Foster was a Pullman porter. Because when you have a railroad and a big railroad hub, that makes sense. So that makes sense. But as far as some of the other people, I don't have as much a strong a direct link to be able to make. But hopefully, as time goes on, one can be found. Yeah, I hope that answers.
thank you. Yeah, that's a good connection to make about the railroads too in that industry as a big employer. Um, let's see, we had a question from Robert. He asked, um, I read that Bakersville, county seat of Mitchell County, so which is north of us. Um, I'm not sure if it was along the routes that you are studying. Um, so we'll see if this is something you have info about. But he said, I read that Bakersville, county seat of Mitchell County, was a sundown town. The town denied, and the town has denied it. In your research, did you see anything on this? And generally, did the Green Book or other publications offer guidance on areas that African American travelers should avoid?
Mm. So I I am only focusing only on two highways, and so there is a lot that I am missing by focusing only on just those two. So if at this time I have not come across any place being specifically as a sundown town. In general, so in the Green Book itself, it does provide driving and travel tips, but I do not recall offhand any of them being of avoid this particular place or these places. It's more so things along the lines of before you leave for your trip, make sure you make all of your lodging reservations in advance, or make sure you take your map and you map out where you're going to go, how many miles you plan to travel each day, and where you're going to stop. It gives kind of advice of that nature rather than don't go here, don't go there, or here. So I think that's probably the best that I can answer your question at this time.
Yeah. Um, Molly asked, did anyone ever do you know if anyone ever did not want to put their listing in the book out of fear? So like, did the Green Book ever get used by racists as a way to target businesses or individuals?
And I've gotten that question before. I haven't seen anything to that effect, whether someone either fear of putting listing it or it being used as a way to target. Um, I haven't seen anything of that nature. Something else that I would also put on the table for consideration is also the Green Book wasn't mainstream. It wasn't mentioned. It wasn't something that would really be on society, biggest society radar. Really, the people who knew about it would be those in the African American community, and be one of those things where if you knew about it, you knew about it. If you know, kind of things. And so, probably the best that I could probably describe it for that time, as far as knowledge and that kind of uses of it.
Thanks. Yeah. If anyone has any other questions, please pop them in the chat. I have a few questions. Um, I was wondering, yeah, just more broadly, since communication about places that were safe and places, places that you could, or places you could get gas, for example, since all of that was so important, I'm curious if you're aware of what other kinds of networks of communication people maintained just to help each other travel. I assume there was just a lot of word of mouth, and recommendations, but if people kept other kinds of lists or, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. So that's one of the reasons why early I started talking about networks as being something affiliated with the Green Book, with the YWCA and the NAACP and other organizations, is because oftentimes these organizations, especially being that they started a few decades before the Green Book was published, they were already more so solidified. But as you already mentioned, word of mouth. I would also want to point out that the Green Book was not the only travel guide for African Americans out there on the market. It just so happens that it's the one that's become back to our collective public memory, if you will. And it was also the one that had the longest running publication of them. I do know there were two or three others, but they were very short lived. I think one maybe had two or three editions. I think another one lasted a bit longer, but not by much. And so there were other ways and how this type of information was circulated in print, in addition to word of mouth, and of course, your own personal networks. I would also mention that I've only seen this one time. Um, if I thought I could grab it quickly, I would show the article. But in the Carolinian, which is an African American newspaper in North Carolina based out of Raleigh, it actually ran an article that enlisted several hotels as well as the two state parks where African Americans could go, and it listed, like, it ran like a big column. It's like, if you're traveling through North Carolina, here are some hotels you can stay in, and it listed about 8 hotels, and turn out all 8 are listed in the Green Book as well. And so that's another example that I can think of as another way outside the Green Book that this information was shared and circulated. So other print publications, of course, the organizations themselves, and if you have your own network, both familial and as well as kinship ties as well. As you mentioned, word of mouth, very solid, very strong.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I have another question, and I think this was asked last year too, but I maybe there's an update. I'm curious if the two buildings that are still standing, that in Asheville, if there's any plans or interest in putting those on the National Register, having them recognized in some way.
Yeah. I haven't heard anything, but that's not to say those aren't in the work and it may not be public yet. So the best recommendation I can give would definitely be to reach out to the Western branch of the State Historic Preservation Office in the area, as well as your local city planning department, and make inquiries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Um, it would be amazing if they could get onto the National Register, but of course there is certain processes and steps to go through. And so, depending on what everyone has going on, kind of varies.
for sure.
Well, I haven't heard anything, but I also am not always in the loop of everything that's going on across the state. So,
Sure. Just be great to make sure that we keep those buildings. So,
yes, not many left still standing
yeah,
across.
especially in the downtown. There's one on Klingman, and then it looks like Wilson's was downtown
It's on Eagle.
on Eagle Street. Yeah, so definitely in the middle of downtown, and so those areas are always ripe for development. So good to keep the significance of those buildings in mind. Um, so there have been a lot of thank yous and appreciation for you in the chat. Um, I'm gonna go ahead and mention some upcoming events we have, and then we'll close out, and people can unmute themselves and say thank you personally too. So, just want to mention that coming up this coming month of September, we're celebrating Labor Day, and so as part of that celebration, we're going to have a lecture in our Appalachian Experience series, our other online series, taking place on Monday evening, September 13th, so in just a few weeks. And this is going to be about the Battle of Blair Mountain. This is a presentation I'm doing, and is on. And the Battle of Blair Mountain was America's largest labor uprising, and it happened in West Virginia, in southern Appalachia, and it was a result of really many decades of wars for union recognition and just better conditions in the mines. And this is a really, really important part of American history that is slowly becoming better known. So you can join me on that day to learn more about that really important part of our history as working people. I'll send a link to that in our follow-up email. And then on September 27th will be our next History Cafe. And that's going to be on a Monday morning. Usually our cafes are on morning times, 10:30 a.m. I'll send a link for this one too, but it's going to be about Black Mountain College in the community in the surrounding Swannanoa Valley. So this is going to be with David Silver of the University of San Francisco, and he's been doing research for many years about Black Mountain College's relationship with the surrounding community, because there's a general kind of thought and understanding that the college was pretty isolated from the local community, and that locals really saw them as being pretty strange out there people. And his research is showing a lot of the ways that, especially through BMC's agricultural projects and its farming projects, it had a lot of relationships with locals and with the Asheville Farm School, which would become Warren Wilson College. So please join us for that, and we'll kind of expand the narrative on Black Mountain College. So again, thank you so much, Lisa, for being with us today and for sharing your research. We'll close out now, and anyone who wants to unmute themselves and say a direct thank you, please do so. And we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Keep the good work.
Thanks. Thank you, everyone. It was wonderful to be with you. Hope you come back. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Ready?
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
All right, I'll close this out now. Thanks again, Lisa. I'll be in touch.
Sounds good. Have a good evening.
You too. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.